My name's Dr. Debbie Chalice and I'm Education and Outreach Officer at the LSE Library. My visual description is I'm a cis white woman. I have dark hair but blonde highlights with brown eyes. I'm speaking to you from my front room stroke office, and I've got loads of my own books behind me on a bookshelf. I'm delighted to be speaking at this conference, and I thank the conference organisers for inviting me. My talk is called Zooming In and Out: Experiences of Public Programming in an HE Archive Library During a Pandemic. When the London School of Economics and Political Science went into lockdown on the 17th of March, almost a week before the rest of the country, the library had to shift resources and student support online, as well as postpone its public engagement programme. The library has run this programme since 2015 to connect non-LSE and non-HE higher education audiences with its collections. It's funded by Research England, particularly after the Women's Library came into the collections of LSE Library in 2012. So to talk about the first wave, our public engagement had previously been circumscribed mainly due to numbers. We're not a walk-in venue, we don't have a museum, but we do have a small exhibition space. Much of our work was based around termly exhibitions and in partnership with other institutions and small, maybe non-heritage or non-academic heritage centres like local studies libraries. The flexibility of institutions to switch to online programming very much depended on their setup beforehand, as the Arts Funders found in its survey of museums last year. And this has been borne out by reports. So we had the LSE Eden Centre for Enhancing Learning, and they already had Zoom set up, as well as online guides and expertise should we need it. Though of course they were concentrating on switching students from in-person to online teaching. So at first I postponed our events for Social Revolutions, which was an exhibition that we'd had running from January through to the end of March, beginning of April. But I decided that we'd try an experiment for our event on the 2nd of April, which was with Rachel Crossley from the East End Women's Museum. And she agreed to this. It was a straightforward presentation and then a Q&A afterwards. It was attended by about 45 people. I would say half of them were from the museum sector, partly because of the nature of the talk, and partly, as one told me afterwards, because they wanted to see if online events could actually work. I decided they could, so I put the rest of the events for the summer term online on Zoom, basically Zoom meeting. And these were mainly book events for Feminist Book Fortnight or fairly straightforward talks, though we did have a performance which we have found by experience works best with pre-record. We also had a very interactive participatory event which was based on the launch of Sisters Doing It For Themselves, which is a collection of oral histories that were going to the Women's Library from the women's sector past and present, I should say women's charity sector past and present. And this was an event that has quite a large panel with full participation from audience members who could unmute themselves and sort of basically have a conversation. Having said all that, I did put in protocols to sort of try and secure events and monitor things as best we could. And these worked pretty well for summer 2020, where our numbers were pretty much the same as we would expect when we were doing in-person events. So between 40 to 75 attending. So like the student-facing services at the library and other research libraries, public programming also underwent a digital shift that has so far retained an element of participation and informality that we managed to keep from our in-person events. Now, as I said, I postponed the Social Revolutions events, and we basically put them all online from September to November. And we found that although we hadn't done any sort of planning around the content, that some of them, because they related to the liberation anniversaries of the Gay Liberation Front, the Women's Liberation Movement from the early 70s, many of them seemed particularly apt in the political circumstances of Black Lives Matter, particularly Arika Oki's on the Civic Archivist. We then also did our first online exhibition, which was on Alf Morris and the 1970 Chronically Sick and Disabled Act, which was accompanied by 2 panel events that were live broadcast on Facebook at the same time as being on Zoom webinar. And again, they're on YouTube, our YouTube channel too. We basically noticed during September to December that there was an increase in audience numbers. We thought this might be because of the sort of semi-lockdown that we were in, and also because we were spending more time marketing on social media. And during this period, we were also working on a bespoke frame of events for an exhibition that was going online, Making Modern Women, which was on interwar women's magazines. And we were also putting quite a lot more time and effort into sort of target audiences of women between about 40 to 60 that we thought might be interested in these magazines, and using social media to attract them, as well as networks and groups like that. So we had scans of these magazines for the online exhibition, and they look amazing, and the exhibition looks amazing online, although I personally miss the thingness of like archives and feeling them. But I think there's a really interesting point by Ariti Galani and Jenny Kidd that in their article on hybrid materialities, about actually what this crisis has shown is to kind of go beyond the binary of digital and physical material culture. And I think this interest certainly from Research Libraries UK, in a report recently on virtual reading rooms, kind of can cross that bridge between the sort of binary of holding and seeing what something's really like and scanning it in. And as the report notes, virtual reading rooms may have a lot more to offer to wider audiences. Now, what we found in the third wave, from January onwards through to really until now, was that a massive increase in audiences. I think this is partly because of our planning for the exhibition from January, started in early February, partly because of LGBT History Month, and partly because I think people were obviously at home in the lockdown between January and March. But what we also found, that this created the advantages of these audiences, created disadvantages too. It basically meant that we couldn't continue using Zoom webinar and having participatory events in the same way. We had to be more focused. Even with a lot of staff monitoring, we couldn't really keep an eye on all of the things that we needed to do. Plus we had a disrupted event. So we basically had to halt online polyvocal spaces for some event formats. And I do think this brings some issues that Cassandra Kist has identified with sort of difficulties with critical thinking in events, and the kind of shying away from controversy and shying away from allowing kind of, perhaps controversial things to be said. However, there's no way we could really cope with the numbers and keep the event safe and secure. We had a responsibility to our speakers, to our audiences, and of course to ourselves. I think we also felt we were sometimes running to keep up with audience demand during that period. So we actually started to do events live on YouTube. And now we're using YouTube as a channel to both store events and look at creating videos to kind of do that hybrid materialities, to actually show the archives in focus. So looking at the legacy of this, basically we're trying to now sort of embed some future planning in response to the events of the last year, 18 months. We're trying to respond to our audience preferences. We did an online survey of what they wanted. We're looking at sort of hybrid sort of blending of events. We know that the next term is going to have to all be online because of LSE not having public events in person. So we're planning for 2022, and we're looking to basically we're searching questions about our content, how we connect online with different audiences, and how we can make the physical presence of archives seem real. So this is partly why we're switching a little bit to YouTube and pre-recorded videos. We were trying to also just keep one step ahead of audience demand, but there's going to be no return from films and online events long term. We found, as the RL UK Digital Shift report has found, that basically the digital shift provides opportunities for our audience to shift, grow and change, bringing more people into contact with our content. And I think in this we need to be mindful of our civic and social role, how we participate in that, the responsibilities of it and monitoring it. We need to work on the framing and the mechanisms that we use too, and try and avoid further inequalities related to access and digital and linguistic literacy. Thank you.